In a city where diamonds gleam as brightly as secrets, one murder cut deeper than the stone itself. A woman vanished into silence, a man clung to resentment, and loyalty was bartered like a cheap gem. Inside a quiet brownstone, two minds measured truth not by evidence, but by fracture. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. It was the kind of Tuesday that wore galoshes and smelled faintly of trout. Not because of Fritz's menu, but because of the city's generous contribution of gutter runoff and damp overcoat humanity. Wolfe was on hour 2 of his orchid session, and I was on page 5 of a racing form that had as much to do with our profession as Wolfe's amber ale did with champagne. The rain had started its soft percussion against the windows sometime after 10. That meant the chances of getting Wolfe to leave the brownstone that day, already a mathematical fantasy, had just dropped below the freezing point. At 11:13 a.m., I'm precise when lightning strikes, the doorbell buzzed, not rang, not knocked, but buzzed, as in the insistent finger of a man who hadn't read the chapter on courtesy in Esquire. I glanced up, waited the obligatory 4 seconds for a miracle that didn't come, meaning Fritz answering the door, and then heaved myself off the couch. By the time I opened it, the man on the stoop looked like he'd just been told the world was ending and that he'd be billed for the damages. The visitor was tailored like Park Avenue and sweating like Canal Street in August. He held his fedora in one hand, a leather attaché case in the other, and enough desperation in his eyes to fill a bucket. His initials, HKL, were stitched into the cuff of his shirt and engraved on the brass clasp of his case. Either he had a thing for embroidery, or his mother hadn't hugged him enough. "I need to see Mr. Wolfe. It's urgent." His voice had a fine tremor, like a violin string about to snap. I gave him a once-over that took less time than it would have if he hadn't looked like a tax audit wearing cologne. "Urgent's relative, Mr. HKL. What's the name behind the monogram?" He blinked, as if remembering he had one. "Leland. Horace K. Leland, Vice President of American Universal Indemnity." He followed me into the office, still leaking anxiety. Wolfe was not at his desk. Orchids, naturally. I gestured toward the red leather chair. "Plant yourself. He'll be down after the flowers are satisfied. Or dead. Whichever comes first." Leland sat, wiped his forehead, and clutched that case like it held a live grenade and half his soul. When Wolfe finally entered, with the unhurried majesty of a man unacquainted with urgency, Leland shot to his feet so fast the chair squeaked. Wolfe gave him a glacial glance and then settled into the throne behind his desk, like a Roman senator preparing to lecture a disobedient province. Leland wasted no time. "Mr. Wolfe, I need your help. A diamond has been stolen, a rare pink diamond, insured for $3 million. Wolfe's left eyebrow lifted a fraction. $3 million what? Monkeys? Umbrellas? "Dollars," Leland stammered. "US currency." Wolfe sighed. "Continue." "It was taken from a secure vault at Carstairs and Bloom. No sign of forced entry. No alarm triggered. Just gone." Wolfe reached for his beer. "Then it is not a theft. It is a vanishing act. Consult a magician." Leland swallowed hard. "Mr. Wolfe, it vanished from a locked climate-controlled vault. Only 4 individuals had access. It was there on Monday. This morning it wasn't." I watched Wolfe's fingers tighten slightly on the glass. He didn't love mysteries. He loved solutions. And $3 million worth of missing carbon had just nudged the needle. Wolfe tapped his index finger on the armrest. 4 individuals, you said?" "Yes," Leland replied, opening his case and pulling out a typed list like it was Exhibit A in the trial of the century. Clarissa Bloom, co-owner. Ralph Deming, head of operations. Erna Grotz, our bookkeeper. And George Holly, night watchman. I took the paper, glanced at the names, and whistled low. "That's a fine little club you've got. What's the initiation? Polygraph or palm reading?" Wolfe ignored me. Has each of these individuals been interviewed? Yes, Leland said, too quickly. They all deny involvement, but one of them must have. Spare us the melodrama, Wolfe said dryly. What was the last confirmed sighting of the diamond? Monday, during routine inventory, Leland said. Clarissa Bloom personally signed off. That night, the vault was sealed. This morning, it was gone. Wolfe leaned back, eyelids drooping with contempt. You have no crime scene, no physical evidence, and no suspects who admit to anything. What precisely do you imagine I can conjure for you? Leland opened his mouth, then closed it. Outside, the rain tapped harder, as if trying to underline Wolfe's disdain with punctuation from the heavens. Wolfe's nostrils flared, not at the rain, nor at the theft, but at the theft of his morning. Mr. Leland, he said, as if the name itself required ironing. I do not customarily involve myself in cases of mere larceny. The police are well equipped for lock-and-key melodramas. But this isn't, Leland started. A murder. Wolfe cut him off. Then my interest is academic at best. And I have orchids, sir, whose bloom cycles are far more compelling than financial ineptitude or employee deceit. I leaned against the desk and waited for the flicker, the one Wolfe always gave before something penetrated the crust. It hadn't come yet. Leland was still a storm cloud trying to thunder on command. He fumbled with his case again. This isn't about the diamond. It's about something larger, something that could destroy reputations. Wolfe made a small sound in his throat. It might have been contempt, or it might have been curiosity clearing its throat. Leland pulled out a second envelope, thick, white, unmarked, and placed it on Wolfe's desk with the delicacy of a man handling live explosives. That's a certified cashier's check for $50,000. Consider it a retainer, not to recover the diamond necessarily, but to shield certain reputations from irreparable harm. Wolfe stared at the envelope as if it were an insect that had learned to speak. Ah, he said finally, the coin of panic. I cleared my throat. 50 grand to plug a leak sounds like premium corking. Wolfe ignored me. What reputations are you referring to, Mr. Leland? I cannot say, not yet. But I need discretion, containment. If the press gets hold of this, if it becomes public that a $3 million stone disappeared from the most secure vault in Manhattan, our clients will vanish faster than the diamond did. Wolfe reached for the envelope, weighed it in his palm, and then placed it on the blotter without opening it. Fritz, he called out, voice precise. Hold lunch. I watched his lips compress into a line of reluctant obligation. The game, as they say, was afoot, but only because the stakes had been properly salted. Fritz's voice came floating up the hall. Something in German that probably translated to, again. Wolfe looked at me as if I had somehow conspired with Leland to rearrange his life. Archie, take down the particulars, names, dates, and anything this gentleman is willing to offer that does not reek of obfuscation. I nodded and reached for my notepad. Leland was already wiping his brow again, though the room was dry and the storm outside hadn't moved in. Wolfe reclined a quarter-inch farther in his chair. That was as close as he ever came to getting his hands dirty. We will require full access, files, vault records, employee schedules. Leland nodded rapidly. Anything you need. I glanced at Wolfe, then back at the envelope. $50,000 said this wasn't just a missing gem. It was a crack in the mirror that someone was willing to pay handsomely not to look into, and we had just been hired to hold the mirror steady. The next morning, I found myself staring at the smoked glass doors of Carstairs and Bloom, wondering if I should have worn gloves, or just borrowed Wolfe's distaste for everything modern. The lobby was chrome and hush, the kind of place where theft was unthinkable, which was usually the first sign it had happened. A young man with more cheekbone than expression tried to intercept me, but I handed him a card and breezed past like I owned stock in the company. He didn't stop me, which meant either the diamond heist had rattled their decorum or I was better dressed than I thought. Inside, The mood was polished worry. Desks gleamed, shoes squeaked, and somewhere behind a walnut partition, millions in gemstones waited quietly to not be stolen again. I was buzzed in by a girl whose lipstick was precise and whose glance said she wasn't in the mood for visitors who didn't sparkle. I was there to meet the suspects. 4 names, 1 stone. No sign of forced entry. If that didn't spell fun, I had lost my flair for irony. I pulled out my notebook and sharpened my smile. The game was afoot, and it wore silk socks. Clarissa Bloom, co-owner and heiress apparent, came in wearing a dove-grey suit and the kind of poise you couldn't fake unless you'd been raised by a butler in a boarding school. She shook my hand like it was a contract and sat with the kind of posture that made you forget furniture had upholstery. "I assume you're here on behalf of Mr. Wolfe?" she asked, eyes cool as cucumber aspic. "That's right," I said. "I'm Archie Goodwin. He reads, I roam. You were the last person to see the diamond." Her nod was slow and untroubled. "Monday morning inventory. I examined it myself. The stone was intact. No signs of damage, no irregularities. It was secured by noon." "Any chance you miscounted? Blinked too long? Dropped it into your purse by accident?" That earned me a smile, all enamel and no warmth. "I'm not in the habit of pocketing 8-figure assets, Mr. Goodwin." I asked a few more and got nothing but polite fencing in return. Clarissa had the vocabulary of a lawyer and the tone of a woman who'd been judged before and come out smarter for it. I left with her name in my notebook and the feeling that she'd prepared it in advance. Ralph Deming looked like he shaved with a straight razor and still thought saluting indoors was acceptable. Ex-military, operations manager, and the kind of guy who believed locks were for other people. He met me in a security alcove that smelled faintly of metal polish and career resentment. "Procedures airtight," he said, handing me a schedule printed in red ink. "The vault logs record every access. 4 authorized, all accounted for, no forced entry, no tampering." He recited it like a catechism, and I waited until he ran out of breath. "You were here Monday?" I asked. "All day. Oversaw a shipment to Antwerp in the morning, verified inventory by 11, checked out at 6. "And you saw the pink diamond?" He gave me a look like I'd asked if the sky was still up there. "Of course." Deming was precise, composed, and wound tighter than Wolfe's pocket watch. But it was the kind of control that left no room for surprise or guilt. That made me itch. People who run perfect systems don't like the idea of accidents, or thieves, or me. I left him scribbling in a logbook and made a note. Deming was clean, maybe too clean. He made my instincts stand at attention. Erna Grotz was the bookkeeper, and she looked like the kind of woman who lived alone with 2 cats and a phobia of misfiling things. Her office was small, the air was dry, and her fingers fluttered like moths around her adding machine. I don't know what happened," she said. I tally what I'm told to tally." She tried a smile, but it came out like a receipt that didn't match the register. "Were you here during Monday's inventory?" I asked. "Yes. I mean, Clarissa did the physical check. I just update the records." "And you updated them?" "Yes. The diamond was present, all accounted for." Her voice went up on present, which told me she wasn't sure about anything except her own job title. She wasn't slick enough to steal a gem and keep her lunch down, but fear has a way of making accomplices out of people who were just trying to keep their paychecks dry. I didn't press her hard. Not yet. She'd either crack on her own, or someone else would do it for her. I tipped my hat, thanked her, and moved on, scribbling, nervous. Knows something. Doesn't know what she knows. George Holly was the night watchman. Barrel-chested, mustache like a broom, and a voice that had seen too many midnight shifts and too few raises. He met me near the service elevator, eyes darting like a man who'd misplaced something and wasn't ready to admit it. "Just routine that night," he said. "Rounds at 10, again at 2. All clear. Vault door sealed." "You see anyone unusual?" He scratched his neck, then glanced at the camera dome overhead. "Nah." I leaned in. "That's a no or a not supposed to say?" Holly gave me a look, half apology, half warning. I heard voices, quiet, around midnight, near the stairwell. Thought maybe it was Ralph. He's got a habit of late paperwork. Did you check? He shook his head. Didn't want to spook anyone. And I figured maybe I didn't hear it at all. Which meant he had, and it had scared him into silence. Something was gnawing at Holly, and it wasn't guilt. It was the kind of fear that comes with knowing something you weren't meant to know. I let him off the hook. For now. But the hook stayed in. I asked for the vault access logs. They gave them to me with the kind of ceremony reserved for royalty and subpoenas. I sat in a corner cubicle and flipped through 3 days of signatures, codes, and clock-ins. Everything was orderly, precise, and dull as toast, which meant someone had taken the time to make it look that way. According to the records, no one had accessed the vault between Monday's inventory and Tuesday morning's discovery. Not even Holly, which made the diamond's disappearance as plausible as a ghost with lockpicking skills. Still, the page didn't lie. It just didn't tell the truth either. I tucked the files into my briefcase and stepped out into the lobby, where the rain had stopped but the tension hadn't. I needed a break. And a sandwich, preferably in that order. I ducked out for a corned beef and a call to the brownstone. Wolfe answered on the 5th ring, which meant he'd finished the beer and started thinking. I don't have suspects yet, I told him, but I've got 1 shaking, 1 polished, and 1 dead inside, and 1 night watchman who heard too much. Wolfe grunted. Get names, get contradictions. I'm working on it. I hung up, wiped mustard off my tie, and started back. What I found waiting in the lobby made my sandwich feel like bad timing. The receptionist's face was pale and locked into something between fear and nausea. Mr. Goodwin, she said. George Holly. He's been found. Where? His apartment, East Village, dead. She swallowed hard, throat slit. And just like that, the missing stone wasn't the worst thing anymore. It had a body now. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe didn't blink when I told him. Holly's dead, I said. Throat cut, East Village apartment, no sign of forced entry. Wolfe didn't ask for details. He just picked up the envelope Leland had left, the one with the retainer check, and tapped it once on the blotter. I do not, as a rule, he said, pursue simple thefts. But murder disturbs the order. I nodded. So we're in? We were in, he said. The moment the stone vanished from a locked vault. This merely confirms what should have been evident. And what's that? Wolfe looked at me like I'd asked whether fire was warm. That the theft was not committed for profit, but for silence. He reached for the beer bottle I'd brought from the kitchen. And now, he added, we must determine whose silence was worth a man's life. I sat down and opened my notebook. The game had changed, and Wolfe was ready to play. I was halfway through transcribing my notes from Carstairs and Bloom, a job I approach with all the enthusiasm of a tax audit, when the front doorbell announced itself like a fire drill. I wasn't expecting a delivery or an invitation to lunch, so I took the 32 out of the drawer and let it sit on the edge of my desk just in case. By the time I opened the door, Inspector Kramer had already managed to look insulted by the delay. His coat was wet, his jaw tighter than a union contract, and his mood was somewhere between a kicked dog and a man who just remembered he hated orchids. Where is he? Kramer barked. Last I checked, I said, he hadn't defected to Uruguay, but I'll go look. Wolfe, to his credit, didn't pretend surprise. He raised a single eyebrow and let his eyes slide to the clock on the mantel as if the interruption had spoiled something delicate. Inspector Kramer, Wolfe murmured. How regrettably punctual. Kramer didn't sit. He marched in like a man ready to serve papers on God, and Wolfe, out of nothing more than intellectual curiosity, let him try. I've been talking to the morgue, Kramer said, not bothering with pleasantries. George Holly had no enemies, No debts, no criminal record, and one throat slit so clean it could have been surgical. Wolfe sighed and sipped his beer. Inspector, if you came to recite police reports, I suggest you speak to a mirror. It will offer the same resistance. Kramer ignored him. It wasn't random, it was intentional. Holly knew something, probably tried to use it, and got silenced. And your evidence? Wolfe asked, with the weary tone of a man asked to believe in goblins. No forced entry at the apartment, Kramer snapped. His wallet was still there, cash untouched, but a drawer had been rifled, fast, like someone was looking for something he wasn't supposed to keep. A diary? Wolfe offered. A love letter? Kramer's jaw twitched. I think Holly was blackmailing someone at Carstairs and Bloom. He saw something. He didn't report it. Instead, he tried to cash in. Wolfe arched a brow. That is not, strictly speaking, a hypothesis. That is wishful thinking in a trench coat. Kramer's glare could have scraped paint. Wolfe, for once, if you know something, spill it. Wolfe put down his glass. I intend to, Inspector, when I know it. Kramer's face was turning the shade of a summer beet, but Wolfe remained unbothered. He leaned back, fingers laced across his stomach, and looked at the ceiling as if it might supply better company. Your theory, he said, requires assumption, not deduction. A crime without evidence, a motive without psychology, and a perpetrator without reason. Kramer snapped. Then give me yours. I have none, Wolfe replied. Not yet, but I have facts. He swiveled to face me. Mr. Goodwin, what did you observe? I gave him the short version. 4 people with access. No signs of a break-in. Clarissa Bloom cold as a mint julep. Deming with a spine made of parade drills. Erna Grotz practically apologizing for breathing. And Holly, may he rest, acting like a man who knew the devil by his first name. Wolfe nodded. And the logs? Clean, I said. Too clean. Then we proceed, not with fury, but with patience. Kramer let out a sound that belonged in a zoo. You sit here sipping beer while someone's out there turning watchmen into cadavers. Exactly, Wolfe said. Because beer improves judgment. Fury does not. Kramer stormed out like a man who'd just lost to logic again. Wolfe, still contemplating the condensation on his beer glass like it held some ancient cipher, finally said, It would be absurd to suspect Clarissa Bloom merely because she was the last to see the diamond. Unless, I prodded. Unless she stood to lose something more valuable than a stone. I waited. Wolfe shifted his eyes toward me. Clarissa inherited half the firm after her father's death. Unfortunately, her father's financial legacy was less a foundation and more a sand dune. Mr. Leland mentioned debts, yes? He did, I said. Lightly, like a man worried about a libel suit. Wolfe drummed his fingers. Then we shall confirm whether the sand has shifted, if she is burdened with obligations she cannot meet, and if the diamond were missing while in her custody. You think she might have tried to cover it up, I said. I think, Wolfe replied, that desperate people make interesting choices. She may not be a thief, but if she found the diamond gone, she could have confided in Holly, I finished. Wolfe's eyelids drooped. And if he saw opportunity in her panic, it may have cost him his life. I rose. Where do I start? In her finances, Mr. Goodwin, he said. Where else does desperation write its truest lines? Before heading out, I did what any sane man does when he's about to dig through other people's money. I fetched Wolfe a beer and opened one for myself. Wolfe took his with a grunt of approval, which was his version of gratitude. I want a discreet sketch, he said. No noise, no trails. I draw soft lines, I said. And if Clarissa Bloom is merely poor and proud, I want to know it. If she's deceitful and drowning, I want to know that too. I nodded. Anything else? Yes, Wolfe said, as if it pained him. Don't flirt. That got a laugh out of me. Are you worried about my safety or my tact? I'm worried, Wolfe said, about the capacity of men to misjudge silk for sincerity. And you are, Mr. Goodwin, a creature dangerously susceptible to tailored distractions. He wasn't wrong, but I also knew when a distraction had teeth, and Clarissa Bloom hadn't smiled once with hers. I holstered my notebook and headed for the door. The air outside was dry, but it smelled like storm. I made 3 calls and a visit. The calls were to a friend in real estate, a banker I owed lunch, and a woman in Midtown who never forgot a credit score. The visit was to a man named Tupper, small-time broker, big-time gossip. He operated out of an office above a tailor shop and had the ethics of a raccoon. You're asking about Clarissa Bloom, he said, lifting his eyebrows so high they almost left the room. Strictly professional, I said. She's stretched, Goodwin. Fancy address, unpaid taxes. Her father's estate had more red ink than a butcher's apron. She's kept the firm going, but barely. Rumor is she mortgaged her half of the building just to stay solvent. Any liens? 2, maybe 3. And 1 loan from a man whose name you say twice if you want your legs to stay straight. I left Tupper whistling and walked to a phone booth. Wolfe answered on the first ring. She's broke, I said, like champagne on a beer budget. And she's either gambling on the firm turning a corner, or on something a little more mineral and portable. Wolfe said nothing, but silence from him was never empty. When I got back, Wolfe was in the plant room, fingers gently pressing the throat of a Miltonia Bloom, like a man testing the pulse of a confession. You're back, he said, without turning. Clarissa's finances are worse than mine during a dry month, I said. She's leveraged, exposed, and 1 step from selling heirlooms. He nodded. The pressure, then, is real. Wolfe adjusted the stem of a slipper orchid. You see, Mr. Goodwin, diamonds are the great deceivers. They appear unbreakable. But the smallest flaw, invisible until exposed to just the right stress, can shatter them. People are the same. Clarissa? I asked. All of them. Deming, Grotz, even the late Mr. Holly. They each wear a surface, routine, civility, fear, but under pressure, the true cut emerges. I watched his fingers linger on the petals, delicate and decisive. So we apply pressure? No, Wolfe said. We observe who cracks without it. He turned and reached for his beer. And we begin with Dawn. Victor Dawn, I said. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. The fence turned consultant. He smells of missing diamonds. Let us follow the scent. The next morning, Wolfe emerged from the elevator dressed for work, which meant nothing more than a yellow shirt under his vest and a look that said lunch could wait. I want Dawn watched, he said. And Deming, begin with Dawn. He is the more combustible of the 2. Both? I asked. You think they're connected? I think, Wolfe replied, that something about Dawn's involvement has been staged, too neatly. If he's innocent, I shall be shocked. If he's not, he will betray himself soon. I scribbled a note for Saul Panzer and made a mental one for myself. Holly's death was a message, Wolfe added, settling into his chair. Now we must determine who sent it, and to whom. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. Begin, he said. Discreetly. I headed for the phone. Wolfe had stopped sipping his beer, and that, more than anything, told me the case had reached the next tier of danger. Following Clarissa Bloom wasn't difficult. She had the kind of presence that made a crowd rearrange itself like furniture. I tailed her from the lobby of Carstairs and Bloom through a curtain of Manhattan drizzle that made my trench coat resentful and my shoes philosophical. She moved uptown, not fast, but with direction, a woman with somewhere to go and someone to meet. Her coat was mink, dark as a secret, and her gloves matched. The heels clicked softly over wet sidewalks, then vanished into the doorman-guarded entrance of a private club, tucked between a florist and a tobacco shop with no window display. The type of place where gin is older than the patrons and privacy comes with silver service. I parked myself across the street under a scaffolding, awning and lit a cigarette I didn't want. Wolfe would have lectured me on the carcinogenic effects of idle curiosity, but I wasn't curious. I was skeptical. Clarissa had grief in her eyes and rhythm in her walk. It was the rhythm that worried me. You don't walk like that if you're innocent. Or if you're alone. She met him at the bar. Even from my vantage point, I could tell he was smooth enough to shave with. Medium build, oiled hair, suit tailored so tight it looked like it had opinions. When he leaned in, Clarissa didn't flinch. She gave him the kind of smile you save for old lovers or expensive lies. That was Victor Dawn, formerly of the Manhattan fencing circuit, now operating under the more marketable label of jewelry consultant. He'd done 2 years for moving hot sapphires out of a Jersey safety deposit box, and now claimed to advise high-net-worth clients on discreet gemstone sales. The kind of advice that tends to get you stabbed or subpoenaed. They talked. She gestured once, precise, restrained, like someone describing a detail best left implied. Dawn nodded too much, sipped something pale, and touched his lapel with his left hand. That was his tell, if you ask me. Crooks don't like their left side exposed. If Clarissa Bloom was just grieving a loss, this wasn't the place, and Dawn wasn't the company. I waited until they left separately, 20 minutes apart, her by cab, him by foot. I made a note in my pocket diary. Dawn, watch list, could polish a lie with his tie-pin. I followed Dawn for 3 blocks. No sudden moves, no rush. He didn't spot me, but then again, men like Dawn don't look for tails unless they've got something worth hiding. He stopped twice. Once to check his watch, once to buy gum from a newsstand vendor who pretended not to know him. He walked like a man who expected doors to open before he knocked. And sure enough, they did. A second-floor walk-up above a foreign exchange booth that hadn't exchanged anything but dust in 6 months. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. The way he checked his lock, twice, then paused with his hand on the knob. That told me everything. He was holding something inside he didn't want anyone else to see. Could have been a bottle, a ledger, or a stone that used to belong to someone else. I waited for darkness, and for opportunity. Dawn wouldn't hold his secrets forever, not with Wolfe breathing down the chain of logic. At 1 a.m., Manhattan hums a quieter song. I waited until Dawn's light blinked out, gave him another 20, then made my way up the fire escape with the grace of a slightly annoyed cat. His window lock was predictable. Most crooks are good at hiding what they steal, but lousy at protecting where they sleep. I eased inside and let my eyes adjust. The place smelled of shaving cream and ambition. Too much of the first, none of the second. The living room doubled as an office. I checked the desk first. A drawer jammed on the right. I eased it open. Inside, a pouch, black velvet, drawstring, the kind you use when presentation matters more than safety. Inside the pouch were 8 stones, unset, unmarked, just enough carat weight to make your conscience go blind. I held each to the light. Whites, 1 pale yellow, a nice blue, no pink, no trace of what we were looking for. I slipped the pouch into a linen napkin and left it where I found it. Dawn might be dirty, but he wasn't stupid. If he had the pink diamond, it wasn't here, which meant either he'd already moved it, or someone else had. I didn't linger. Dawn wasn't the kind to sleep like a saint, and I didn't want to be mid-inventory when he got up for water or guilt. Before I left, I snapped photos of the receipts tucked under his blotter. Nothing illegal, but 3 of them showed jewelry brokered through a third-party handler named Eldred Mercantile, which hadn't existed since 1946. Nice trick. I scanned the bookshelf. Ledgers, not much fiction. A few pages of stationery marked with scribbled initials, CB, RD, and one I couldn't place, BK. Benno Klein? The walls had no pictures. The air was too cold, and the man who lived here liked his lies laminated. I exited the same way I came, closed the window behind me, and left no trace but the silent satisfaction of knowing we'd rattled a cage, even if we hadn't found the canary. Back on the sidewalk, the night felt like it was holding its breath. So was I. At 2:07 a.m., I walked into the brownstone and found Wolfe exactly as expected. Seated, beer in hand, book unopened, and expression mildly acidic. He didn't look up. You took your time. He wasn't home alone, I said. He was sleeping with secrets. I handed him the pouch. He glanced inside and grunted. No pink, I said. Nothing distinctive. He's fencing something, but not the prize. And the receipts? Fake fronts, Eldred Mercantile among others. No license, no footprint. A vacuum with a stamp. Wolfe took a long pull from the bottle. You believe he's guilty? I believe he's involved. That is not the same, Wolfe said, and yet it is often adjacent. I poured myself a cup of coffee and waited. Wolfe's thoughts were brewing, which meant mine could rest, but not for long. Wolfe finished his beer, placed it on the tray, and turned his eyes to me as if they weighed more than his shoulders. Mr. Dawn is not the thief, he said. I blinked. You're sure? He is a scavenger, useful, opportunistic, unoriginal. The true architect of this theft is methodical, patient. Dawn lacks the temperament. I frowned. So Clarissa's clean? Unlikely, but she is not the source of the plan. She may be its trigger, not its engine. I waited. Ralph Deming, Wolfe said, as if the name had always been waiting in the air. Military, precise, emotionally opaque, also overlooked. A man passed over for partnership, trusted with access, but never offered equity. You think he took it? I think, Wolfe said. He waited for the opportunity, and when it arrived, he acted, not in haste, but in orchestration. I stood. So we switch tracks? We pivot, Wolfe corrected. Watch Dawn, but follow Deming. He leaned back. One will stumble, the other will step forward. We need only observe which occurs first. By 9 a.m., Saul Panzer was on Dawn, tailing him with the kind of silence that made shadows look noisy. Wolfe wanted eyes on him but no pressure, just a thermometer in a crooked mouth. That left Deming to me. I caught up with him outside Carstairs and Bloom, where he lit his cigarette with the kind of efficiency that didn't trust matches to strike on the first try. He walked like a man who measured sidewalk cracks and remembered them. I followed, loose and polite, for 12 blocks. He visited a shoemaker, picked up a paper, and spent 25 minutes at a bank. Too long for a deposit, too short for a loan. Inside the bank, I caught a glimpse of a signature on a form. Deming's. Next to it, something called Garrison Holdings. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe had already finished breakfast and opened the Oxford Book of Essays. Well? He asked. Deming moves like he's got something to lose. Then let us, Wolfe said, help him lose it. And just like that, the next piece was in motion. There's a kind of hush on 47th Street that's louder than noise. The Diamond District, Manhattan's glittering little pressure cooker, doesn't appreciate a gumshoe asking too many questions, especially when the name Rose-Cut Trine starts floating around like bad air in a sealed vault. I did my usual rounds with the subtlety of a brass band, ducking into storefronts, shaking hands, lifting eyebrows, and paying for cheap coffee I didn't drink. The cutters, brokers, appraisers, they all knew something, but their lips curled like raw silk under steam. Nobody would say the name, but everyone had heard of it. A pink diamond that shouldn't exist, a trinity of brilliance that left men squinting at shadows. It wasn't a fence job. Too quiet, too weird, like something had been surgically erased. By the time I finished circling the block, I had 3 things. A splinter of gossip about a recut stone, a contact who said I should talk to Elmo behind the appraisal shop, and a feeling in my gut that someone had tried to make something beautiful disappear. Elmo Rosak used to be the kind of man who could cut a diamond so clean it'd make your soul feel unfinished. Now, he had tremors in both hands and kept his tools under a velvet cloth, like a priest with palsy guarding holy relics. Goodwin, he muttered when I walked into the back room. You're 10 years too late, or 10 minutes too early. I pulled up a chair and waited. Elmo poured 2 fingers of schnapps into a ceramic thimble and didn't offer me any. "There was a stone," he said. "One stone, pink, big as a hazelnut and so clean it could break mirrors with envy. I saw it once, in Klein's hand. He didn't want to cut it, but they paid him more than he could insult." "They?" I asked. He didn't blink. "Some things ain't plural. One man, no name." "And what happened to the stone?" He drew 3 dots with his fingertip on the velvet. Triangle, tight. He broke it into triplets. Same shape, same flaw. You'd think they were born that way. Why? Because someone wanted it to vanish without being lost. In a district where reputation cuts deeper than carbide, the name Benno Klein was a ghost in daylight, too real to be legend, too dangerous to say aloud. The further I dug, the quieter things got. No one had seen him, no one had called. No one had anything to say that wasn't soaked in caution. But stories have a way of leaking through locks, and I pieced together a shape. Klein, once the Mozart of microscopic flaws, the man who could make 1,000,000 vanish with a well-placed facet. He'd vanished himself 3 months ago, leaving behind a studio, unpaid rent, and a rumour that his hands had been hired for a job so precise it made surgeons look like whittlers. I caught a break when a kid who swept floors for a tool supplier said he'd heard Klein moved to Queens. "Not the nice part," he added. "The kind of place where good things go to rot quiet." It wasn't much, but it was a smell, and smells, as Wolfe would tell you, are the start of every truth worth unearthing. The boarding house on 148th Street in Queens had 3 cracked windows, a sagging roof, and a tenant roster that read like a police blotter. I walked past a man on the stoop smoking what smelled like paint thinner and asked about Klein. He shrugged. "Might be room 4B, might not." Inside, the hallway smelled like old gas, cheap gin, and the sweat of lives unspooled too slowly to matter. Room 4B had a door like a confession booth, cheap wood, too light to keep in secrets. I knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Silence. Then the muffled drip of water, or blood, if you've been at this as long as I have. I tried the knob. Unlocked. The room was dim, cluttered, and dead quiet. A greasy stove against one wall, a cot that sagged like regret, and a faint glimmer on the floor that didn't belong. Diamond dust, a smear of it, trailing from the tiny workbench to the crumpled body on the rug. Benno Klein, what was left of him, stared up at the cracked ceiling like it had asked him a question he couldn't answer. Klein had been stabbed just once, precisely, right beneath the ribcage, like someone who knew anatomy or didn't need to. His shirt was missing, his jacket folded badly in the corner, and his fingers still curled like they'd been trying to hold something no longer there. There was no wallet, no tools, no phone, just a dull scalpel on the bench and that smear of diamond dust, enough to prove he'd touched the stone, maybe even finished it, but not enough to say where it had gone. I took a careful look around. No forced entry, no sign of a struggle, and the window latch was jammed from the inside, which told me the killer had walked in with a key or a smile. There was a single photograph taped to the wall, Klein, younger, holding a trophy, surrounded by men who looked like they'd rather be elsewhere. One face was blurred from time or fingerprints. I called the cops, then I called Wolfe, and somewhere between dial tones, I realized this wasn't about theft anymore. It was about erasure. Wolfe answered on the 3rd ring, which in his world is the equivalent of shouting. "It is you?" he asked. "It's me," I said, "and Klein's not going to be cutting anything else." A pause, and then, "Dead. Deader than Tamerlane." I gave him the address, the layout, the dust, the lack of a wallet, the glint in the air. He didn't interrupt once, just listened, breathing like a man reading Latin through a veil of steam. When I finished, he didn't sigh, didn't huff, just said, "You will return. Bring your notes." "That's it?" "Yes." I thought maybe a condolence for the man. He used to be an artist. Artists die, Mr. Goodwin. Art is what survives. Click. I pocketed the phone and looked once more at Klein, who'd tried to make something disappear and wound up gone himself. I didn't have Wolfe's detachment, but I knew when silence meant something deeper than sorrow. Back at the brownstone, I poured myself a beer and waited for Wolfe to finish communing with his orchids. When he waddled into the office 20 minutes later, he lowered himself into his chair like a man seating judgment. "Proceed," he said. I gave him everything. Elmo, the triplets, the diamond dust, the photograph. He steepled his fingers and shut his eyes like a man tuning his own brain. "It was never for sale," he said finally. "Not truly." "You're saying nobody wanted to make money off it?" "No, it was too distinctive, too traceable. A stone of that quality could not circulate unnoticed." "So why recut it?" "To disfigure it." I blinked. "Why not just smash it?" "Because even hatred desires narrative. To divide it, to make three flawed echoes of something flawless, it is both punishment and monument." I let that one sit. So what was Klein? The executioner? No, the confessor. He reached for his beer. Yes, he actually reached for it, and took a sip. Someone wished to remove the stone from existence, not by hiding it, but by murdering its essence. That, Mr. Goodwin, is vengeance, not theft. Wolfe remained in his chair, staring not at me, but at something abstract. His own sense of justice, maybe, or the twisted elegance of human spite. Outside, the city hummed like a restless mind trying to forget. "You see," he said at length, "a flawless diamond is not only a treasure, but a threat. It reflects what we are not. We either covet it or destroy it." I nodded, though I wasn't sure which side Klein had ended up on. Wolfe tapped the edge of his desk. "Greed, Mr. Goodwin, merely mutilates beauty. It chips, it claws, it bargains. But hatred obliterates. It cuts without purpose, without precision. It leaves no art behind. Somebody sure made sure of that." He gave a small, rare smile. "Yes, and now they believe the wound is closed." "Is it?" "No." He gestured toward the orchids on the shelf. "A scar, even on stone, remains." That was Wolfe at his most poetic, and also, maybe his most tired. I left him to his thoughts and wandered into the kitchen. Fritz was filleting trout, the pan already warm. Not for the first time, I wondered if the real luxury of living in that brownstone wasn't comfort, but clarity. It takes a specific brand of audacity, or desperation, to ring Nero Wolfe's front bell at 11 in the morning. That's the holy hour reserved for orchid communion, when the rest of the world can go hang, preferably without interrupting the root misting cycle. So when the chime echoed through the brownstone, I glanced at the clock, muttered something suitable about sacrilege, and made my way down the hall. The woman on the stoop was wrapped in a grey coat that hadn't been designed to impress anyone. Her face was narrow, her eyes wider than seemed comfortable, and her hands were neatly folded over a handbag that looked like it hadn't unknotted since Roosevelt. "I won't keep him," she said, before I could deliver the standard sermon. "Just a few minutes, for my brother." She didn't smile, and she didn't plead. She just waited. I hesitated. Then I opened the door wider and led her in, sins against horticulture notwithstanding. Fritz cast a glance up from the hallway with a look that could have curdled imported cream, but he knew better than to block a guest already admitted. I led her through the office, gestured to the red chair, and informed her, without much optimism, that Mr. Wolfe would be down shortly. She sat without fuss, her coat remaining buttoned, her eyes scanning the room like it held a secret she wasn't sure she wanted to find. By the time Wolfe lumbered in with the grace of a Baroque organ being wheeled into place, she was already standing. "I'm Agnes Holly," she said simply. "My brother was George Holly." Wolfe, already disgruntled at being removed from a phalaenopsis in mid-coax, gave her the kind of look usually reserved for men who offered him cold cheese. "I do not attend to death notices," he said. If your brother requires legal exhumation, I suggest the police. Agnes opened her bag with a deliberate calm and produced a slim notebook, bound in cracked leather. No, she said. Just this. His journal. He kept it the week before he died. The moment Wolfe heard the word journal, he eased his bulk into his chair with the solemnity of a bishop receiving communion wafers. He extended a finger. I took the notebook from Agnes and handed it over. She didn't watch Wolfe read. She kept her eyes on me instead, as if weighing how much I'd already guessed. The handwriting looked like it had been done with a fistful of gravel. The entries were brief, unnumbered, and maddeningly elliptical. Spoke Werf again. Ledger won't vanish. Another. Claire. Shouted at J. Reed. Deal. Dangerous. Then a name half erased, then rewritten. Vesper. Vesco. Wolfe turned a page. The next was smudged, but one line stood out like a nailhead. They think I know. I don't. Not all. What do you make of this? Agnes asked. Wolfe didn't answer. He was too busy rereading a scrawl that looked like second pink, not real. I leaned closer and caught the tail end of something more human. Dreamed of the door again. The one they said never opened. The air shifted in the room, not dramatically, but enough to make me wish I'd brewed stronger coffee. Wolfe shut the book with 2 fingers and set it down. Wolfe leaned back, fingers steepled, lips pressed in their classic disapproval pose. His eyes, usually reserved for accusing soufflés of mediocrity, rested instead on Agnes Holly. This ledger, he said, it was not your brother's? No, she replied. He mentioned it in passing. Once, on the phone. I thought it was his bookkeeping. But when I asked, he said, it's not mine, it's hers. Hers being Miss Clarissa Bloom. Her eyes flickered, then steadied. He didn't say, but he was afraid of it. I flipped back through the pages Wolfe had marked, stopping on the one with the argument. Claire. Shouted at J. That would be Clarissa. And what? Julius Morrow. John Franklin. She wasn't supposed to be there that night, I said. But he saw her, or heard her. Agnes didn't answer. Wolfe rose, not quickly but with purpose, and rang for Fritz. Beer, Mr. Goodwin, and bring the Rolodex. We need Saul Panzer. Agnes watched all this with a kind of bleak satisfaction, as if the storm she'd unleashed was expected. You believe him, then? She asked Wolfe. No, he said, but I believe his fear was genuine. By the time Fritz delivered the beer and the Rolodex, Wolfe had already dictated 2 names and addresses in the tone he used for surgical instructions. Saul Panzer was to locate a copy, original, not photostat, of Clarissa Bloom's financial ledger, referenced in the journal. Ori Cather, with his usual blend of cologne and low cunning, would reintroduce himself to the staff at the Modernist Gallery as a well-heeled patron with a taste for pink gems and gallery gossip. Wolfe didn't bother with pleasantries. He passed each man a single envelope containing exactly 1 paragraph of typed directive. When I raised an eyebrow at the omission of my own assignment, he didn't blink. You, Archie, will stay here. I require clarity, not kinetics. That stung a little, but I figured it was a compliment in Wolfian dialect. The man was in motion, and in Wolfe's world, that was rarer than a pink diamond with a clean conscience. He turned back to the notebook, not reading this time but contemplating, like it was a broken clock that somehow kept accurate time. I believe, Wolfe said, folding his hands as if prayer were imminent, that Miss Clarissa Bloom should be invited for tea. Tea, I echoed. You want me to offer her scones or subpoena? Neither, he replied. Merely an opportunity for candour, dressed, of course, in civility. I'd seen Wolfe play this card before, the soft summons, the velvet invitation that made even the innocent twitch. So I made the call, using the tone I reserve for actresses and old ladies with antique revolvers. Clarissa agreed with a pause long enough to suggest rehearsal. I gave her 3 o'clock. When I reported this, Wolfe merely nodded and requested lemon, not milk. That was his way of signalling war with doilies. You think she'll bring the ledger? I asked. No, he said. She will bring something better. The truth or the fear of it. Perhaps both. He closed the notebook and tapped it once against the desk. This, he murmured, was written by a frightened man trying to leave something behind. Miss Bloom will tell us whether it was a legacy or a warning. When Agnes Holly stood to leave, there was no dramatics. She thanked Wolfe, not with words, but with a look that understood what kind of currency she was spending. She declined Fritz's offer of a cab and walked out into the grey light, like a woman returning to a smaller, colder world. I watched her go, then turned back to Wolfe, who was now idly plucking at a bit of lint on his vest, with the same concentration some men reserve for naval strategy. "You believe she's clean?" I asked. "Uncluttered," Wolfe said. "There is a difference." The room settled again into its hush. The notebook sat on Wolfe's desk like a relic from a failed expedition. Inked fear pressed into every page. Across from me, Fritz reappeared with a second beer and an expression that said he was preparing the tea service with all the gravity of a duel. Wolfe picked up the notebook again, opened to the page with Clarissa's name, and said softly, "This ledger, if it exists, is not numbers. It is a mirror, and we must see who avoids it." The red chairs were filled, but nobody looked comfortable. Wolfe had arranged them just so, in a crescent wide enough to observe every twitch and shallow breath. Clarissa Bloom perched on the edge of hers like the velvet might burn her. Grotz folded his arms like he was expecting a cross-examination. Dawn kept tapping the bridge of his glasses, while Ralph Deming adjusted his cufflinks 3 times in 30 seconds. They weren't seated for comfort. They were seated for judgment. Wolfe didn't rise. He didn't need to. The gravity in the room was already pulling in one direction, toward him. "You will not interrupt," he said. "I shall speak, and you will listen. You may object after, though I doubt it will avail you." Fritz, anticipating theatre, had drawn the drapes and brought no refreshments. The air in the room was dense, not hot, but full of something older than temperature. Guilt, maybe. Memory. Clarissa's hand drifted to her throat and stayed there. Wolfe drew in a breath that seemed to summon history itself. "Let us begin," he said, "with the timeline, for therein lies the first fracture in your little masquerade." He turned his head slightly. "Mr. Goodwin, the notes, if you please." I handed Wolfe the folder I'd prepped that morning, typed, labelled and tabbed like a hymn book for heretics. Wolfe opened it with the reverence of a scholar and the precision of a scalpel. "At precisely 4:43 p.m., he began. On the afternoon of the gallery unveiling, Miss Bloom stepped away to take a call. Mr. Deming remained at the refreshments table. Mr. Dawn was entertaining the Morrows, and Mr. Grotz was, by his own account, adjusting the lighting, though no bulb was changed. Clarissa shifted. Wolfe did not look up. The gem was last confirmed visible by Miss Franklin at 4:47. The alarm was not triggered, though the case was subtly altered. A glass panel, swapped. That takes time, at least 4 minutes uninterrupted. He turned a page. By 4:51, Miss Bloom returned, and by 5:02, Mr. Holly had arrived, late, yet conveniently. It was Mr. Holly who later claimed to have noticed the imperfection in the display. But, he tapped the page. The panel he claimed was fogged, had no residue. He lied. Why? Clarissa blinked rapidly. Grotz muttered something that didn't earn translation. "Because," Wolfe said, "he had been told what to look for. Told by the only person who saw the error but dared not report it." His gaze landed squarely on Clarissa. Clarissa's face didn't crumble. It tightened. The skin around her jaw pulled taut, as if holding in more than words. Wolfe let the silence breathe a moment before proceeding. "You were not the thief," he said calmly, "but you saw what happened, or perhaps only suspected. And when Mr. Holly cornered you in the vestibule after the guests had gone, he gave you the option." She didn't speak. but the way her eyes slid toward the carpet said plenty. You admitted seeing someone tamper with the panel, Wolfe went on. Or at least that you had doubts about Mr. Deming's sudden interest in the pedestal. Holly, no fool, recognized leverage. He said he could protect your name, or expose your failure of vigilance, for a price. Deming sat straighter, but said nothing. Clarissa looked up then, voice low. He said I owed him, for not going to the trustees. I didn't even know what he meant at first. Then, he sent copies of what I'd signed. A falsified inventory. He had it. Grotz grunted. Dawn exhaled slowly, as if unburdened. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. He didn't want money, Miss Bloom. He wanted control. But then, he found out more. Enough to die for. His head tilted, owl-like. Which brings us, he said, to Mr. Deming. Deming gave a little huff, more breath than sound. It might have been amusement, or the first sign of resignation. Wolfe turned slightly in his chair, lacing his fingers across his middle, like a judge who'd already decided the verdict, but would allow the defense a final whimper. Mr. Deming, he began, your tenure at the Modernist Gallery predates every name in this room, 22 years. That kind of seniority either brings security or breeds resentment. Deming didn't reply, which Wolfe took as encouragement. When the board selected Miss Bloom for the directorship, despite her shorter resume, you congratulated her publicly and distanced yourself privately. But not from her documents, not from her habits, not from the safe combination. Deming's lip twitched. You're guessing. No, sir. I'm observing. You created duplicates of the key inventory pages 6 months ago, when you had access. You gave them to Holly in exchange for silence. He became your instrument, but he overplayed. Greed is rarely patient. Wolfe paused. And when you saw he had begun pressuring Miss Bloom not just for secrets, but for power, you decided to shut him up, not for her sake, but for yours. Clarissa turned to Deming then, as if seeing a stranger. Wolfe leaned forward, voice dropping. You didn't kill him, Mr. Deming. Not then. But you let it happen. And you watched. Wolfe didn't raise his voice, but it landed like a gavel. Mr. Holly was not an accident, nor was Mr. Klein. He let that hang while the air redistributed itself. They were symptoms of the same ailment, elimination in service of concealment. Holly, once a petty extortionist, discovered more than he intended. He had a habit of pressing too hard. Eventually, he pressed on the wrong nerve. Wolfe's eyes flicked toward Deming. No need to name him yet. The room had ears. Klein, Wolfe continued, was subtler, a cutter of remarkable precision. The stone that disappeared, originally flawless to the naked eye, was not sold. It was altered, recut, faceted again. Its profile changed, value preserved, signature destroyed. It required a skilled hand, and Klein had one. Deming stirred. Dawn's eyes narrowed. But Klein was a risk. He had the knowledge, and more dangerously, the skill, that made him indispensable, until he wasn't. Wolfe sat back, fingers steepled. 2 deaths, but one intent, to erase a trail that began not with greed, but envy. A professional slight left to fester. The theft was secondary. The motive was personal. He turned his head, owl-like. Mr. Dawn, I believe it's time we discuss what became of the diamond, after it changed shape. Dawn leaned back, arms folding slow, like he was wrapping himself in deniability. I handle acquisitions, he said, not resale. I wouldn't even know. Pfway, Wolfe said, with force that startled even me. You wouldn't know how a recut gem, stolen from a gallery under your direction, entered the inventory of a Fifth Avenue boutique whose owner once paid your brother-in-law's gambling debts. Dawn blinked. Then again. A man doesn't need handcuffs to be arrested. You leveraged what you had, Wolfe continued. The stone was passed through a South Bronx intermediary, then filtered through 2 shell dealers, both of whom reported to a Mr. Marcello Dawn, alias Dean. From there, it reached clean hands, purchased by an anonymous client, gift-wrapped. Wolfe reached for the envelope he'd kept beside the orchid log. It was placed finally in a ring, he said, on the finger of a woman whose tastes you fund and whose silence you maintain. A woman who, incidentally, was photographed at a fundraiser last month, wearing that ring. He opened the envelope. "Mr. Goodwin, if you'll pass this around." I handed the photo to Clarissa first. Her hand shook. Dawn's mouth flattened. Deming didn't even glance at it. He was watching Wolfe now, like a man waiting for the drop. Wolfe lifted the small black velvet box from the drawer. It hadn't been there that morning. "As you may imagine," he said, "Miss Quayle was most cooperative once the circumstances were delicately conveyed. I assured her we weren't tax collectors." He opened the lid, and there it was. Compact, elegant, deadly in the way truth always is. "The ring," Wolfe said, "contains a 1.6 carat modified brilliant, faintly tinted. On casual inspection, unremarkable. On closer inspection," he reached for the loop I'd placed beside the notebooks. "A single inclusion. A microscopic veiled feather in the pavilion, identical in shape and position to that found in the original Winthrop diamond, noted in the original GIA assessment by Mr. Klein." Clarissa covered her mouth. "Holly discovered it," Wolfe went on. "He never said it outright, but he alluded to it. He knew the stone hadn't vanished, it had evolved, and he knew who made that possible." He didn't point. "Mr. Deming," the name dropped like a pin in a tomb. "You organized the recut. You enlisted Dawn's channels, and when the web began to twitch, when Klein mentioned the inclusion during his second lunch with Holly, you knew it would unravel." He closed the ring box gently. "You couldn't erase the flaw, Mr. Deming. Only the witnesses." Kramer had been leaning against the doorframe with his usual brand of smouldering suspicion. But at Wolfe's last remark, he shifted forward, jaw cocked like he was chewing gravel. "You sure about this, Wolfe?" "I do not dabble in conjecture," Wolfe said, tone dry as cedar. "The sequence is as follows. Deming perceived an injustice. He decided to rectify it by converting Clarissa Bloom's first public triumph into an untraceable asset. He used Klein's skills, Dawn's distribution network, and Holly's opportunism." Kramer nodded slowly. "And then cleaned house." Clarissa made a small noise in her throat. Not quite speech, not quite sob. "I believe," Wolfe said, "he intended only Holly's removal. Klein was unexpected. Holly likely showed him the inclusion as proof. Once Klein realized what he'd helped conceal, he threatened to withdraw, or worse. And Mr. Deming, never one to leave a fuse burning, struck again." Deming stood abruptly. "That's slander." "No," Wolfe replied. "It is architecture. I built it on your silences." Kramer stepped toward him. "Mr. Dawn, you're coming with me for questioning. Deming, don't move." Clarissa finally exhaled and crumpled like a paper doll in the rain. She slid sideways in the chair. I was already moving. "Women," I muttered, "always wait for the climax." And she fainted, of course, with style. She wasn't light, but she folded neatly. I caught her under the arms and managed not to clock my chin on the armrest. Clarissa Bloom, terror of boardrooms and darling of the art pages, had gone completely slack. "Easy," I muttered, lowering her gently to the rug. "You're collapsing in good company." Kramer grunted. Dawn tried a step forward and got a growl from the lieutenant for his trouble. Wolfe made a small gesture, dismissive, almost bored. "Mr. Goodwin, do summon Dr. Vollmer. Miss Bloom has finally met a reality she cannot negotiate." I checked her pulse. Rapid, but steady. Her mascara hadn't smudged, which I'll admit impressed me. "She'll come around," I said. "Probably regret it, but she will." Wolfe had already turned back to Kramer. "If you require formal statements, I will provide them after dinner. This room requires fresh air, not repetition." Clarissa stirred faintly as I got her into a recovery position. "Next time," I told her, Skip the drama and try fainting in Wolfe's orchid room. It has cushions. Wolfe, rising, God help us, paused by the ring box. His thumb brushed the velvet like he was closing a ledger. The case, as far as he was concerned, was no longer criminal. It was concluded. Fritz, in a rare act of restraint, didn't hum as he served the trout. It had a delicate lace of sorrel sauce across its back like a signature from the French Alps, and the steam curled up like it didn't want to interrupt anything. Wolfe, seated in his yellow chair at the dining table, wasn't talking. That was fine by me. I wasn't either. Sometimes silence is just a lack of noise. Other times, it's a monument to the things you've already said, or maybe shouldn't have. Wolfe lifted his fork, inserted it into the trout's side like a polite anatomist, and chewed slowly. I gave it 10 more seconds before he broke the quiet with a pronouncement about trout lineage or the culinary errors of Scandinavians. But it never came. We ate the whole lunch like that. 2 men, 1 fish, and the kind of silence that doesn't ask to be filled. For once, I didn't miss the noise. I was still thinking about a woman who'd fainted and a man who hadn't blinked while watching her fall. After coffee, black, thick, and judging, Wolfe returned to the office, and I slid over to the window. The sky was doing its impersonation of wet concrete, and the traffic below was doing its usual slow-motion stampede. Yellow cabs flinched past pedestrians, horns bleated like angry sheep. It was a city built to crush illusions, and still somehow sell you more of them by noon. There was a woman across the street standing under an awning, tugging at the collar of her mink. She had one of those rings, sharp sparkle, probably bought with a sharper promise. I watched it catch the grey light and thought about Dawn's girl, her careless grin, and the diamond with a dead man's secret embedded in it. It made me wonder, how many other stones in this city had been kissed by blood before they were slipped onto fingers that never ask questions? Wolfe might trust mineral flaws more than human ones, but I knew better. Both cut when you're not looking. He spoke without turning. Trust, Archie, is a mineral, not a philosophy. I stepped away from the window. I didn't realize we were in the geology phase of digestion. Wolfe's eyes stayed closed, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. It is clear when pure, hard when formed, and irreparably marred by the smallest intrusion. Sure, and like most minerals, it gets mined, sold, and faked. He opened one eye. Precisely, and when forged, it shatters both buyer and seller. Clarissa's trust in Holly was naive. Holly's trust in gain was terminal. Deming's trust in justice was purely cosmetic. I perched on the edge of the red chair. You're saying trust has clarity grades. I am saying, Wolfe murmured, that it must be tested under pressure, heat, and time. Most men fail one of the 3. He reached for his beer with the solemnity of a priest reaching for communion wine. I didn't clink my glass to his, but I did nod. Trust might be invisible, but it left one hell of a residue. Wolfe glanced at the orchid on the desk. A small purple dendrobium, nothing flashy, but it had survived a rough stretch last month when Fritz forgot the misting cycle. This orchid, he said, developed a lesion invisible to the eye until the bloom opened under full sun. Sounds like Deming, I offered. Looked clean until you turned the heat up. He didn't dignify that with a reply. Wolfe doesn't riff off metaphors. He dissects them. Flaws, when deeply embedded, evade superficial scrutiny. They only declare themselves when precision cuts across their grain. I nodded. And people, like diamonds, tend to crack when under a jeweler's saw. Wolfe sipped his beer. Or when the light is too direct. He was talking about Clarissa now, or Holly, or maybe himself. I didn't ask. Some cracks aren't there to be named. They just keep widening until someone falls through. Wolfe leaned back, folded his arms, and closed his eyes again. Clarissa's silence was a loyalty purchased in guilt. It cost her her name's integrity. Holly's betrayal was loyalty inverted to money. It cost him his life. And Deming's loyalty to ambition wore the costume of patience. It cost him everything. I whistled low. You're in a generous mood today. No, merely observant. He reached for a peach from the bowl, turned it over like it might whisper a confession. Loyalty is the most overvalued of virtues. When true, it requires no reward. When false, it demands one. I took that in. Across from me sat a man who had never once declared loyalty to anyone, yet kept the same cook, the same assistant, the same chair for decades. Go figure. Still, I said, Clarissa didn't kill anyone. No, Wolfe admitted, but she let the lies breathe. And lies, like rot, are loyal only to decay. I had nothing for that. Some verdicts don't need echoing. Wolfe was misting the orchids himself, a weekly ritual, always done with the kind of tenderness reserved for antique weapons or rare first editions. He didn't look over as I rose and stretched, so I wandered to the coat rack, grabbed my jacket, and straightened my tie. You'll be out? He asked. For a walk. Maybe I'll buy a newspaper, or see if Dawn's girl pawned that ring yet. He grunted. Indulge your cynicism, but wear a hat. I tipped an imaginary one. Always. And I'll be sure not to trust any man whose lapels never wrinkle. That got a pause. Just a fraction. Then the misting resumed. I took that as a nod. Outside, the air tasted like wet iron. Inside, the orchids gleamed. The case was closed, and Wolfe was still Wolfe, unmovable, insatiable, and despite everything, the only man I'd trust with a secret I didn't want told. In the quiet that follows justice, even the orchids seemed to breathe easier. The diamond's secret was buried again, not beneath soil, but beneath conscience. For every polished surface in this city, there's a flaw waiting for light to expose it. And sometimes, it's the light itself that breaks what it touches. Do you think vengeance can ever masquerade as loyalty? Or was it only pride, wearing a prettier name? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth once found always echoes.